Thank you for tuning into the Parkside Parents Podcast. I'm Robbie Lacey, the middle school pastor, and it is our mission in student and children's ministries to support families as we help unbelieving students become committed followers of Jesus Christ. We are excited to have with us today Jonathan Holmes. Jonathan is the founder and executive director of Fieldstone Counseling. He is also the author of The Company We Keep and Counsel for Couples. Today, Jonathan and Danny are going to discuss and answer the question, how do I care for my child who is experiencing anxiety?
Jonathan, thank you again for joining us on the Parent Podcast for Parkside. It is a privilege to have you here as we talk about all these different issues that relate to parenting and caring for children and students. Our topic and our question today is asking, how can I care for my child who is experiencing anxiety? This season of life with COVID has been uniquely unpredictable. So we've got kids who are going back to school and they don't know whether they're going to be in person, online. They don't know if their sports are going to be playing week by week, and life is generally unpredictable, but I think that we are feeling a heightened sense of that right now, which I think for many children and teens that's causing them to experience heightened levels of anxiety because in all the normal ways that uncertainty about the future can provoke anxiety, we're feeling a really strong sense of that right now. And so if you're prone to anxiety, I know from the experience of students that I've talked to, that has been the case. So as we think about how parents can care for their kids, what advice would you give to parents on how they can care for their child or their teen as they're experiencing anxiety right now?
Question, Danny, and I think that you're hitting the nail right on the head. I mean, anxiety, teenagers, those two words go together probably more so than at any point that I can remember. I mean, in conversations with teens and talking with people who are working with youth, anxiety is a huge issue. So the first thing I would say is make an environment that is comfortable and conducive for your teen to talk about anxiety. I just want to go out there on a limb and say, I almost can guarantee that at some level your teen is experiencing some level of anxiety. I don't know very many teens who would say, yeah, no worries, no fears, no anxieties. There's almost some type of threshold. So parents, what type of environment are you making? One of the ways that we prepare that environment is through personal vulnerability. We talk about our own fears, our own worries, and our own anxieties so that they realize that they're not alone and that anxiety is not something to kind of stuff away and to not talk about. Another thing with anxiety is to realize that for a lot of kids, it exists on a spectrum, right? That it's not always going to look like maybe panic attacks. It could come out in a way where maybe they're overachieving in sports or in academics, or maybe it's more obsessive compulsive behaviors where they're constantly, checking for germs, or they're worried about contamination or getting COVID. For other kids, it might just be, nerves about school and about what the new school environment is going to look like or what the future is going to look like. In all of these, there are so many different exercises, conversations, and things that need to happen that we can provide for you in the resources after this podcast. But again, just good conversations with your kids to draw them out, I think is incredibly important. One of the things I find sometimes with parents is that they're just nervous to have those conversations because they're not sure where to go with whatever content that they get. And so one of the best things I think, honestly, that parents can say sometimes is, hey, I don't know, but I'm willing to come alongside you and get whatever help we need to get. So you might not have an answer to what your teen might be experiencing. Be okay with saying, hey, I don't know, but let's travel this journey and let's travel this path together.
That's really good. And as you talk about, those conversations, I know from the children and students in our ministries here at Parkside, we have all across the spectrum parents with kids who tell them everything and wear their heart on their sleeves and have all of those open lines of communications. But also, especially me, as I have high school students, I have parents who are telling me, my kids do not tell me anything. They just come home, they shut the door in their room, and they don't share anything. And so it makes me think about how many students, teenagers, or children are dealing with anxiety, yet their parents are in the dark about it because they don't have those conversations. Are there any ways that whether it's signs or symptoms that parents can kind of identify that their kids are struggling with anxiety. And even beyond that, how can parents be building bridges into conversations, channels of communications with their kids so they actually can talk about these things?
Yeah. Great question. I'll answer the latter question maybe first about, hey, what are some ways that we can do that? And I'd say a little bit of it is just a tweak in language of how we ask questions. Maybe the question is, hey, what happened at school today? What are you doing? What do you got for homework? How was your day, etc. That typically are going to be questions that are oriented towards content. You're going to get details, but maybe just tweaking the question to say, hey, how are you doing today? Which wants process and feeling. To say, hey, what was the hardest thing about your day today? Or what was something that surprised you about what happened at school today? Or maybe what's weighing you down, what's on your heart? And so what we're trying to do is to introduce heart-oriented language that gets you beyond just kind of the superficial layer, that moves you a little bit deeper. And let me give you another one that I think we all need to incorporate into our vocabulary as parents is, how can I pray for you? And we might not think that that's a natural question to ask our kids, right? That's maybe a question that adults feel a little bit more comfortable asking each other, or spouses are more comfortable asking one another. But how can I pray for you begins to open up a doorway to say, what's on your heart? What's burdening you? What's weighing you down? What makes you happy? What makes you joyful? Right now, maybe they give you a one-word answer. Hey, school, or I want to get a good grade, or, don't bother me. But it's a doorway, right? It's a doorway to begin to walk through, and maybe you push in a little bit deeper. Maybe the next day you say, hey, how are you doing with X, Y, or Z, or whatever you brought up? So I think tweaking your questions, moving forward with how can I pray for you is always a step that we can take in the right direction.
That's really good. Are there any, we'll link to show notes for all the resources that we want to provide, but are there any standout resources that you've read, whether it's books or articles or podcasts or anything that have been especially helpful on this topic?
Yeah, I want to give you two things, Danny. First is a book called How to Help Your Anxious Teen by Jessica Thompson. She might be a new author for some of you. She's the daughter of Elise Fitzpatrick, which a lot of you might be more familiar with her mother. It's a really brief book, but it's a super helpful book to really talk about, Danny, what you had alluded to earlier of how do I know anxiety has moved from just everyday fears and worries to maybe I need to reach out and actually get some backup and get some help. She's going to help you navigate through some of that. She's going to talk to you about what are some of the signs and symptoms of, say, generalized anxiety disorder, of when anxiety begins to impede everyday functions in life. Things like hygiene, things like sleep, things like school performance, things like, relationships at home. So would want to commend that to you, as well as a support group that Fieldstone's actually offering in the middle of October. We'll link to it in the show notes, but it's a teen girl support group for anxiety. And it's an 8-week course where it's facilitated by a couple of our child and adolescent counselors to help teen girls walk through and navigate in a safe, secure, confidential environment just what anxiety is, how do we turn to the Lord in the midst of it, and just provide them that type of environment to work through those things together.
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us again in our children and student ministry. We want to support families as we help unbelieving children and students become committed followers of Jesus. And we want to do that in every way that we can, especially with the real difficult topics of depression, anxiety, and all these things that so many of our children and teens are dealing with. So we're thankful for your expertise and your wisdom on this, and we hope that it's helpful for our parents.
Thanks for listening today. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And please check out the show notes below for more resources regarding the topic we covered today. Tune in next week when Danny and I answer a question you all are thinking but are too afraid to ask. What does a youth pastor do anyways?